The apparent goal of Resident Evil Requiem is to combine together the classic survival horror style of the earlier entries of the series with the popular action-oriented style of the later entries of the series, and to bring harmony across these two modes of gameplay in one ultimate Resident Evil experience. Does Resident Evil 9 succeed in this goal? No, not really. Instead, it feels like you're playing two incomplete games glued together with some filler material placed over the top to try to hide the seams, in the hope that by combining these two incomplete games, this will become one holistic experience. But to me, this is the game design equivalent of those Family Guy cutaways, where technically the two modes of gameplay are interconnected through the technique of cross-cutting, but it is a very shallow, forced association that in the long run doesn't hold together at all, especially on repeated playthroughs. And obviously, I think the game would be better off if it just focused on either the Grace style of gameplay or the Leon style of gameplay, and then fully developed that style across a coherent campaign. I think that's a pretty safe assessment. But I would go so far as to say that if Capcom were determined to have these two styles of gameplay represented, Resident Evil 9 would have been better off just accepting the disjoint and separating the campaigns into their own isolated experiences, like Resident Evil 6 does. Because as it is now, the forced codependent structure undercuts each character's campaign much more so than elevates it, and often the worst aspects of the game's design come from Capcom trying to insist that these two campaigns are connected when clearly they are not. So let's begin by talking about some opportunities for interactivity that just do not happen. Alright, so there are multiple ways you can create interactivity between two different styles of gameplay. The first and most surface level is, of course, resource sharing, where you could have Grace and Leon share a set of resources so that what you do with Grace impacts what happens to Leon later on. Now, I do think this is the most shallow way to interconnect styles of gameplay, because you can basically do this with anything as long as they have resources. But since resources are so important to survival horror, it does make sense that this would be a big focus of the game's design, and I think we all just assumed this would be a natural point of strategy in Resident Evil 9, but it really isn't. The characters are shockingly independent from one another. There may be some minor resource overlap in the mansion, but that's not important.
Got some business to take care of. See you later.
What is important is that the characters have two distinct economies from one another, Grace with the blood and Leon with his credits, so that no matter how poorly you route Grace's resources in her section, Leon will always have the credit system to fall back on, and vice versa, even though Grace doesn't really do much after Leon's section. But let's say you get into the lab and Grace is practically unarmed, totally fine, because you can craft everything you need with the blood economy. In fact, by dividing the game into two different inventory systems and then cutting the playthrough in half by those inventory systems, it means that the need for long-term resource routing is pretty much non-existent, and Capcom made sure of that, because you only need to worry about Grace's resources in the first half of the game, and then you only need to worry about Leon's in the second half. And then the game makes sure to provide the resources that Leon may need in the first half right there in the level design, like it's the first day of school. So in the sniping challenge, here's a bunch of sniper rifle ammo. In the chunk boss fight, here's a shotgun and a bunch of shotgun shells. And then in the second half of the game, in Grace's lab cameo, it makes sure to provide her, hey, this is the crafting recipe that you need for the bottles and acid, and here's plenty of blood and scrap while you're at it.
Is that all, stranger?
Versus if you had a single inventory system, then the game could reasonably expect you to gather materials early on and then carry them into the late game, like the rocket launcher in Resident Evil 4. So that's a lot of depth being sacrificed right here for this two-character structure, and them being able to lightly assist one another with resources is not meaningful enough. The standard is that the characters must
Need one another.
and make legitimate sacrifices, but as it is right now, the characters don't share their toys. They just play side by side like toddlers. And a funny example of lack of resource interaction is the Requiem ammo in the intro section of the game, where you'll notice in the intro levels, Leon has 5 Requiem bullets. And you will come to find that Leon eventually gives his Requiem to Grace in her opening mansion section, and in Grace's mansion section, Requiem ammo is really valuable and important. So it makes sense to you as a player of, okay, I will conserve this ammo in these throwaway sections so that when I give the weapon to Grace, she'll have more shots available. Well, it turns out that even if you save those 5 Requiem shots, Grace will only have 1 available in her section. And even more ridiculously, if you spend them all and have 0 remaining, Grace still gets
1 bullet.
as if the 2 sections don't actually connect.
Why isn't it possible? It's just not. Why?
And the irony is that bullets and ammunition become essentially meaningless later on because you get flooded with them. So the only time this Requiem ammo is actually meaningful is right here in this early section of the game. And that's where Capcom makes sure, do not let the characters screw each other over. We need them to be self-contained when it actually matters. Keep them separated. Along those same lines, the most interesting resource of them all has no interactivity between Grace and Leon, which is the save ribbon. Now this, I think, would be extremely interesting, where let's say during the early Grace sections, there is a finite number of saves, so that if you play the early Grace sections really optimally and take the risk of having longer saves in between checkpoints in order to store up these ribbons, then when you get into the Leon section, you only have these finite number of saves to use. And that could be a very powerful way to connect the 2 gameplay styles, especially because it would give some sense of stakes to Leon's campaign, where the decision they ended up making was have him autosave practically every encounter so that if you die, God forbid you have to lose 5 seconds of progress. And we're definitely going to talk about that later on. But anyway, not only do the characters have separate money systems, they literally have different saving systems, which feels bizarre, I just have to say, especially because it really minimizes the role of the save ribbon, where you only need to worry about it realistically for like 1, maybe 2 sections of the game, and then the rest, it basically doesn't matter. And there's a really funny article on Screen Rant, which normally would not be something I would ever reference in my reviews, but coincidentally, this is perfect because this poor player made the mistake of thinking that the ribbons would be somewhat consequential in the later game, and so he ended up hoarding them in the early game, which would be natural to do, only to realize, wait, this is completely pointless. I could have just been burning them constantly. Another wasted opportunity are the antique coins in the Mansion for Grace, where they only have meaning in that section of the game. They do not translate over to Leon in any way, and they don't even translate over to later sections for Grace, other than literally being converted to scrap. They are just this one self-contained economic item, perhaps an artifact of what the game originally was planned to be. Leon has nothing to do with these coins. He won't even pick them up. So you can't even get a basic economic tension of either spending them on Grace's upgrades or Leon hoarding them and then selling them for credits. Probably because the developers know, well, obviously you'd want to just sell them for credits because once you enter the second half of the game, Grace's upgrades don't matter. So they have to hard lock this resource to Grace to force you to spend it on her. This game hates Grace because not only does it throw her style of gameplay off the edge of a cliff, but it doesn't even allow her to interact with Leon's items in her own section. It quarantines them away in special dressers that she can't figure out how to open up. And then even when you see his little credit trackers right there, Grace can't even touch them. She can't even gather them for Leon. Back off, this is daddy's money.
Ow! You pervert!
Poor Grace. So in terms of character resource integration, I do not think it justifies this chopped up structure at all. Which brings us to the second, more natural style of integration, which would be having the characters influence each other's level design. And Capcom's approach here was to make sure to technically have it exist, but to minimize its effects as much as possible. So beginning with the intro sections, there's no interaction at all. It's that Family Guy cutting away stuff. So then after that point, you play through the real bulk of Grace's gameplay, the mansion, or the care center as it's properly called, uninterrupted. And the reason why, obviously, is because the mansion and Leon are incompatible with one another. He would annihilate any sense of challenge or level design if he was actually able to interact with the mansion when it matters. So what they do is they make sure that you go through the majority of the care center gameplay so that when they let Leon in, his impact will be minimal. Unless you're doing a little bit of sequence breaking or something, once Leon enters, Grace has already completed the rock quest. And all she has to do is walk down the completely safe hallway. And on Leon's side of things, the only required material in the mansion is this exclusive corner office that Grace can't even access. So in terms of required material, you can enter the mansion, ignore any activity that would affect Grace in any way, do this lame, basic, easy room encounter, and you're done. That's it. And then all of the other potential overlap is optional side quest stuff. It is not fundamentally built into the design of the game. Clearly, the developers are trying everything they can to have the characters be near each other without actually meaningfully interacting.
What are you doing here?
Someone kidnapped me.
In fact, some of this lack of interaction can be weirdly paradoxical, like with Chunk and the butcher, or I guess the chef as he's called, where during the Grace campaign, you can actually kill both of these mid-bosses, and it's not actually that hard, honestly. And so it would logically follow with this interconnected style that if you kill them earlier in the run with Grace, then they will be dead when Leon appears. Nope. Leon, even if you kill Chunk with Grace, still fights him as a boss fight. And I don't care what insane lore justification there is for this. In terms of gameplay integration, there is none. It doesn't matter what Grace does, Leon will still fight this boss. Same with the Butcher. Even if you kill the Butcher with Grace during the Protect sequence with Leon, he will still appear. And then, of course, during Leon's main campaign, the Grace sections... Wait, there are no Grace sections.
Why did you kidnap me? Why me?
And why this matters is because if the game's design is not gaining much in terms of resource integration, and it's not gaining much in terms of level design integration, then what is it actually doing to offset all of the structural issues that this interconnecting style creates? And that is what we're going to talk about next. One of the greatest aspects of Resident Evil 4 that makes it so replayable all these years later is its difficulty curve and gameplay structure. No game is perfect, but Resi 4's campaign is among the best I've ever played because of how consistently it develops, where in the beginning it has this snappy introduction, iconic, brings you right into the gameplay system, and then from there is this nice, gradually building, rising action with memorable difficulty spikes like the cabin, like the water hall, like that crazy clock tower. And as you progress as a player, not only in terms of your knowledge and skill, but also in terms of your resources, the game adapts by escalating its design, introducing Plagueis, introducing more aggressive enemies, introducing enemies with different weapon types and new combinations of enemies, and gradually building on challenges that you've completed before with new elements, with new dynamics, bringing in Ashley for extra vulnerability and resource drain because you actually have to share your health with her.
Watch out for me!
And then, of course, rank, dynamic difficulty, quietly escalating in the background, powering up the enemies as you play longer and more consistently. The game is all about development and tension. Mikami is a master of that. And so you end up getting this beautifully escalating difficulty curve as a result. Resident Evil 9 does none of this. It's so obsessed with the idea of swapping from gameplay mode to gameplay mode that it never gets around to actually escalating beyond an introductory level. That's why it feels like two demos glued together, because you only have two core sections of development where you have Grace in the care center, and then you have Leon in his abandoned city. Everything else in between these two sections just feels like swapping between different modes of play. And so difficulty curve wise, instead of having this nice gradual building upwards towards a climax, instead it's like a needle on a scratched vinyl record just skipping back to the first track over and over again. Because I think if they actually escalated the game's structure, it would become obvious how messy and disjointed it is. And so one very basic solution for that is, well, just don't escalate the structure. If everything is low grade and easy, then everything is consistent, right? Because think about this on a practical level. By gating Leon's campaign behind completing Grace's campaign, essentially, they either need to A, risk alienating a ton of players who actually are more interested in playing Leon by forcing them to play a very difficult and well-developed Grace campaign, which is going to involve strict routing, level memorization, save management, don't forget that, and long-term resource consequences. Those are the types of things you'd need to insist on, which might alienate you if you're buying the game to parry chainsaws, bruh. Or B, just nerf Grace's campaign so that it's not a barrier to Leon no matter how basic of a player you are. And that's exactly what they did. Here are some examples.
Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?
First off, all of Grace's introductory stuff, complete filler. And one way you can tell something is complete filler is if it cannot be scaled into a higher difficulty. Because if you turn on Insanity Mode, for example, you will hardly notice the effects of the difficulty increase until you enter the care center. So all of this introductory stuff with her, completely disposable.
Come on, wimp.
The next sections that I can only assume are intentionally nerfed, because if they aren't, that's genuinely concerning, are the combat encounters for Grace. And I cannot tell if Capcom actually consider these somewhat significant, because the way the game frames them and the way they're placed in the level design, they are implied to be significant, but they are completely nothing. And what I'm referring to is in the care center, when you go into the parking garage and you have to shoot down the construction equipment coming at you. In a proper Resident Evil game, that would be some kind of boss fight, right? It's set up, it's telegraphed, they even put a save ribbon and a typewriter right outside the door, so there's no fear of the dreaded run back. But then it's nothing. If Grace wasn't swearing and freaking out, I wouldn't even know this is supposed to be some kind of set piece. And why this matters isn't difficulty for difficulty's sake, but because you need combat to create resource management, risk assessment, and decision making. But if the combat is this easy, there is no risk to assess, and there are no decisions to be made, especially because you end up gaining more resources than spending them. same thing when you enter the basement with the meat grinder. Again, the level design, the placement in the difficulty curve, the fact that once more they have a typewriter with a save ribbon right there next to it, which is there in Insanity mode, by the way, and then a pile of ammunition waiting for you, suggests, okay,
Difficulty spike.
Nope.
the encounter is so easy, you just walk backwards in the corner and do head and knee shots, that Capcom might as well play a cutscene and just hand you the ammunition.
Processing is almost complete. Processing complete.
And why this matters is, once again, you don't have a chance to pay off what you've been building up to. The encounter is so static and simple that decision making and routing
Seem pointless.
Also, fun fact, I was curious how this would play in Insanity, given how tanky that mode is, and how genuinely it would be quite a challenge in a sort of Kuso way to have to fight all of these tanky zombies in this pit. But it seems Capcom were afraid of that happening, so they drastically reduced down the stun to be similar to standard mode. So if you're thinking that Insanity is going to be the solution here, it isn't.
Sweet, baby!
But I'm sure once you get all the batteries and plug them in and turn on the power, all of those prisoners are going to get set loose and you're going to have some kind of like epic boss fight to cap the chapter, right? No, you just walk down the hall and do a really intense QTE. So later on, okay, we've got the escape sequence, the helicopter isn't working, you gotta go into the lab, now we're gonna get to the climax. Visually, the game seems to think so, with all of the epic things happening, but gameplay-wise, it's just another
Prescribed.
simple sequence that is basically impossible to fail, other than that highly technical debris dodge. Can't forget that.
Watch out!
And if you're still doubting whether or not they nerfed Grace's campaign to make Leon's as accessible as possible, let me bring you to the ultimate example, Grace's final
Boss fight.
in the entire game, if it even qualifies as one, where you shoot the girl with the Requiem while flipping light switches. They did everything in their power to make that boss fight as scripted as they could without technically making it a QTE. I call this the pretense of gameplay, where it looks like gameplay should be there, but it just kind of isn't. Because first of all you need to do is shoot her with the Requiem ammo, and so this could have been, at the very minimum, a bit of a resource routing check where they make sure, okay, have you been saving up your Requiem ammo? Have you been preparing yourself for this encounter? If so, then you can bypass a lot of its difficulty with this resource check, which is kind of lame, but it's something like Mother Brain in Super Metroid. And then if they did it properly, you could still defeat her without having to use the Requiem ammo, but that would require much more precise spacing or routing or just a higher level of execution, something like that. But instead they go with, all right, let's just hand you a pile of Requiem ammo right outside the room. I wonder what this is for. And they don't have any competing counter incentives either. Like, imagine if they put a bunch of blister heads in this area while you're having to deal with the girl. That way, you'd have some tension between, all right, do I spend the Requiem protecting myself from the blister heads? Or do I spend the Requiem stunning the girl? How do I juggle this? Any kind of dynamic, anything. Unless you can't hit the broadside of a barn with a pocket full of ammunition, there is no challenge.
Give me a break.
Even that janky jumping out at you quick reaction surprise attack stuff that you get in some of the boss fights in Resident Evil 4, not even that is present, because the only time she jumps out at you and grabs you, it's incredibly helpful because she sets you up very conveniently for a point-blank shot. This encounter simulates combat, it looks like it's combat, but it actually subverts it in almost every conceivable way. And I think that's just a strong symbol of Resident Evil 9's approach to game structure. It doesn't really care about creating a campaign, it just wants to invoke one. And so with Grace's campaign hammered to hell, that puts a lot of pressure on Leon's half of the game to deliver a fully developed experience, and it just never manages to get there. And why that is probably a number of reasons, but there are 3 key ones that I want to focus on. 1, static segmented enemy encounters. 2, save spamming. And 3, resource overflow. So to start with the enemy encounters, did you notice that throughout the campaign, you hardly are ever attacked from the back or at multiple angles at once? And instead, most of your encounters have the enemies laid directly in front of you. And the reason for that is because rather than walking into an area and then being ambushed, as often happens in Resident Evil 4, instead the game uses a more Souls-like structure where the enemies are pre-placed into the area that you're coming into. Which means that in terms of advancing forward in the level design, you only have one front of attack, which is where you're going. And even when you are ambushed, the enemies tend to come from a very clear choke point. Like in the pit, there is the gate you have to open, or the SWAT encounter where there's that one doorway that you can just grenade. Or even in the warehouse, there's the wall where everyone spawns. Once again, you can just grenade and then retreat back. The most glaring example of this has to be in the turret section, where once you get the chip in that section and you're about to leave, the game does spawn in a wave of enemies to ambush you, but they all come from the front. And so all you have to do is just, all right, let me run back real quick, get back in the turret, and just bomb them at this really clear choke point. And the game doesn't have a counter wave placed near the turret to try and stop this. This is why the game really struggles to become more difficult in Insanity mode, because even if you make the enemies tankier, unless you have overlapping groups surrounding the player, it doesn't shut down the strategy at all. You just shoot more. And then on top of that, since the game is continuously connecting all of the encounters through this hub overworld, that means that as you're pressing forward, if things start to get too intense, you can just retreat. And even though the game does try to put enemies in the hub area, they are so vulnerable and uncoordinated that they're more like walking credit drops than they are threats. Especially because of your ability to run and parry, the enemies can't lock you down. Like in the sewer encounter, the idea is that you drop into the sewer, and then you have to fight your way through this horde of enemies, but you can just run past them all. And worst comes to worst, maybe parry a time or two, but then once you jump that gap, it's like Red Rover. You've entered the safe zone. Those zombies can't threaten you anymore.
And there goes the battle!
And what's even funnier is that if you decide, well, I want to kill these zombies for the sake of resources, you can jump back over the gap and just slowly whittle them down completely at your leisure. And they will try to block you into certain areas once you enter them, but it's very half-hearted. There's way too much space, and the zombies themselves like to occupy their initial positions a lot, which means that throughout pretty much all of Raccoon City, a strategy that the game really struggles to shut down is just hit and run tactics over and over. Like that very first warehouse encounter in Raccoon City, I can tell that's meant to be a real difficulty spike in a set piece, but if you just let the zombies spawn, throw a grenade where they're spawning, and then retreat back, you can just slowly pick the zombies off one by one. And the enemies are horrible about grouping together and attacking you as a unit, and ridiculously easy to pick off because of their lack of teamwork. Which brings us to the next issue of segmentation, because one counter to this could be, in the level design, well, if you try to back off and hide in the corner, eventually all of the enemies will group together and just crush you in the corner. But the level design segmentation does not make that possible. Meaning, like back in the warehouse, there are zombies up in the rafters that could potentially throw shit at you or synergize with the enemies down on the ground. But the way that the level design is broken up is that enemies only spawn in segments that you control. So you get to encounter a wave, clear the wave, step forward, spawn the next wave, retreat back, clear that wave, step forward, spawn the next wave, retreat back, rinse and repeat. It's the 3D version of the stepping exploit in 2D run and guns. And the sad part about it is that there are potentially interesting encounters in the game that are completely ruined by this approach, like the glass floor fight. I think that is the most interesting piece of level design in the game, and I love the concept of using the environment in this way, where you can get the kill by breaking the glass underneath the enemies, but then the trade-off is you're losing more space for yourself, and eventually if you get too overzealous, you will kill yourself along with the enemies by breaking the glass. That is such a cool bit of environmental interaction. But unfortunately, because they break the encounter up into this simple order of operations, any of those potential trade-offs don't take place, because once you learn the route of taking the enemies out on the glass, they never get the chance to use this trade-off against you. They just sit there, passive, inactive, giant, juicy targets. And Insanity doesn't scale this either, because it doesn't matter if you make the enemies more tanky, insta-killing them with breaking the glass has the same effect. And then even when the game brings in the ranged enemies, that doesn't matter, because once you learn that trip point, you can easily isolate and kill without having to interact with the floor. So all of this potential is completely lost by these static, overly segmented enemy encounters. One last example is the final encounter of the game before you do the boss fights. The one where you go into the room and the lickers are up in the ceiling and it's this nice constrained space. This finally could be an intense claustrophobic encounter with enemies overlapping with one another. But like I said earlier, the developers just seem uncomfortable with this concept, and so what do? They solve the encounter for you. They place a tank in the front corner of the room, they place a tank in the back corner of the room. What should I do with these? And then yes, the encounter starts. You throw the first tank, you blow it up. You throw the second tank, you blow it up. You clear out any remaining lickers, and then you take a nice smoke break, prepare your grenade, and sit and wait. That's the encounter. That's the culmination of this game's level design. And I'm not saying that they couldn't have the encounter begin with throwing the tanks and blowing them up, but that shouldn't be it. What should happen is that you throw the tanks, you blow them up, but that's just the opening salvo. More lickers and other enemy types should continue to pour into the room so that when the last batch of enemies spawn, there is some sort of overlap, and to prevent that overlap, you need to play incredibly aggressively. But instead, since the enemy encounters are so passive and since the enemy design is so passive, you can play purely defensively, and that becomes an overwhelming strategy because there's no mechanical limitation or system restrictions
to punish it.
Especially with parry, because in the past, if you got stuck in the corner and you had enemies on top of you, that's just a checkmate. You failed. But with the parry, and now a rechargeable parry, that's not the case. Getting stuck in the corner and having them lunge at you is not a losing position.
Not when you've got the hot get out of jail free card.
And if you think execution and consistency are going to be a barrier against this strategy, let me introduce you to this game's save system. So one way to help offset having static, easily clearable encounters, like Resi 9 does, with OP mechanics like the parry, is to introduce the idea of consistency. meaning that even though you will have 3 rather simple encounters, by requiring all of the encounters to be played in one sequence, that gives them more depth because one minor mistake in the beginning of the first encounter may impact what happens at the end of the third encounter. This is one of the essential ingredients that helps make combat feel impactful. After all, most combat balance is based off of the concept of risk and reward.
If you're on the offense and commit to something that's quite rewarding, then there's a good chance that there's some kind of punishment coming your way if the opponent successfully avoids it.
Just look at the parry, or the perfect parry, for that matter. If you could just access the perfect parry whenever you wanted without execution as a consideration, does this break the balance of the game? Obviously, it does. So the reward is extremely high. Now, what is the risk? The risk is that you will miss the input and get hurt or killed. That is the consequence. Now, that sounds like a legitimate consequence, and it could be if there was permadeath, or if there were insanely long checkpoints, like Souls or maybe some other games.
The checkpointing is atrocious. I frequently found myself playing for 10 to 15 minute stretches without hitting a checkpoint in a single level. And worse still, some of those stretches were capped off with what are essentially mini-boss fights. That meant if I died on one of those mini-bosses, I wouldn't even get a shot at trying again without retracing my steps through the same 10 to 15 minutes of enemy encounters.
But in a game like Resident Evil 9, where pretty much every encounter has its own auto-saved checkpoint, what is actually the consequence of this? The actual consequence is like losing a tiny bit of progress, and if it's at the beginning of the encounter, you lose nothing. So if this is the new standard, then why not allow the player to save after every single hit? What would be wrong with that?
Can make your triumph feel a little limp.
What's wrong with it is that it creates risk detachment. Risk detachment is when you start playing an action game and you realize there's not actually a consequence to dying right here, so I do not need to worry about real combat balance. Instead, what I can do is just keep resetting the encounter until I get exactly the situation I want to get. And as a result, combat loses any emotional stakes or sense of consequences, which is ironic for a survival horror game, because isn't the whole premise of survival horror that the combat creates tension? This is like going to see a horror film and being able to control when the movie scares you.
Come and play with us, Daddy.
And this does connect to in-game behavior, because what you'll start to do is not even to bother to play out the consequences of the combat encounter, where if the checkpoint was 15 minutes, let's say, and you get in an ugly situation at 10 minutes, you're going to try your best to play through so you can get to the end of that 15. But if every combat encounter is this tiny little self-contained chunk, then what you do is that if you make a mistake early on, rather than feeling the consequences of that mistake over time, you just instantly reset it. Like, remember the final encounter with the tanks? Well, let's say you misthrow one of the tanks and it doesn't get the liquors that you want it to get. Rather than playing through the entire encounter and trying to make up for that first missed throw, you just reset and rethrow it until you get that first throw. And then you get the second throw very consistently, and you've beaten the encounter, right? Versus, let's say this was a 20-minute checkpoint and you misthrow that first tank, you're not going to reset that 20 minutes of gameplay to try to make up for that minor error. But the less attached to risk you become, the more you play this way, and this is actually the correct way to play in this paradigm. Why wouldn't it be? Shame? What shame? It's the developer that needs to take the responsibility of the player's behavior in the system that they create. Not peer pressure, not fan communities, the developers. And this will be relevant in the next section coming up.
This is called foreshadowing.
And if you're thinking, okay, sure, but this only applies to standard difficulty because the relentlessness of insanity makes these baby mode checkpoints worthwhile, well, that brings us to the third issue that definitely impacts insanity: resource overflow. When it comes to evaluating a difficulty mode, I have one major rule. which is never trust a difficulty mode upon first impression, especially these days. And that's for two particular reasons. The first is that developers will actually put effort into the initial impression of a difficulty mode, but then that effort often tapers off very quickly. Corneria in Star Fox 64 is the golden example of this, because in expert mode, they rework the stage, they add in extra enemy spawns, it seems completely different and radical, and you're like, whoa, Star Fox 64 expert is no joke. But then you play through the rest of the stages and yeah, not exactly the same amount of effort. And like I've already hinted throughout the course of this review, that definitely holds true for Resident Evil Requiem as well, because a lot of the encounters are not that scalable, like the meat grinder in the gray section, or they just don't bother to scale them. And then when you get into the Leon sections, the amount of additional spawns and extra enemies in the encounters is negligible. You got that Corneria syndrome with that first street stage where they add in the blister heads and you're like, whoa, okay, this is gonna get nuts, but it doesn't really escalate that much. Same thing with the warehouse where they add in some extra gun enemies and you're like, oh man, this is it. But then for most of the encounters, if they're adding extra enemies, it's not that noticeable, I'll tell you that much. And like I said before, I was especially disappointed by the lack of change in the glass floor fight, because I was really excited to see, whoa, what if they add in a bunch of extra enemies here? Then they could make more use of the floor, but no, it's basically the same. The shift is not as insane as the name would suggest. So that's number one. Developers usually front load all this stuff to make you think they put in more effort than they did. And number two, which is the more important one, is resource overflow, resource scaling. Because if you think about the difficulty curve and the adjustments they made to Insanity, basically what they did, like a proper modern developer, is they increased the enemy health, they increased the enemy stun, they increased the enemy damage, and they increased the enemy tracking and speed. That last one I don't have forensic analysis of, but it definitely seems that way, because that is how people handle difficulty modes these days. That way you don't have to redefine content, redefine enemy layouts, redefine stage design, all of that.
What the hell did you just say?
So if you think about the way this affects the difficulty curve, it's not properly scaling the difficulty curve in real time. Instead, what it's doing is it's just lifting up the difficulty curve universally, but it's not dynamic, really. And so if you look at the player's
resource level,
at the beginning of the game, your resource level is going to be the lowest, not counting metaprogression stuff, which we'll talk about next. So that is why at the beginning of the run, so the start of the care center and that initial street fight with Leon, the Insanity mode's effects feel the sharpest because it has lifted itself up and you haven't had a chance to scale with it. So for example, with Grace, it took a full Requiem shot and a ton of ammo to finally take out the singing girl enemy. And then with a standard knife, I had to use 18 slashes to take a zombie down. By the way, the enemies don't get smarter, meaning they don't adapt to your tactics. They just get tankier, so you can always abuse how stupid their AI is. And one strat that I found was you jump through the window and then slash them when they jump through, and then you just jump back through the other side, and the zombie's like, okay. Windows are one of Grace's ultimate weapons. But anyway, speaking of ultimate weapons, eventually what you do is you discover the Rip Knife, which does crazy amounts of damage, and there you go. You've now scaled up with the Insanity mode changes. I will say though, over my entire experience with Resident Evil 9, the most engaging time I had was playing early Insanity mode with Grace and having to engage in this janky Souls-style combat with the most tanky-ass zombies. Was it Kuso? Certainly it was, but it required more routing and effort than anything in the Leon campaign. That being said though, once you get your hands on crafting, it's over, baby, because you can create a nice little feedback loop where you kill enemies to get blood, you craft blood to make rip knives and bullets, to kill more enemies to get more blood. It isn't a perfect loop because the blood and scrap are finite, but it feeds itself enough that by the end, even on Insanity with Grace, you are strapped. You are rolling deep with bullets and knives. And what's funny is that incentive-wise, things like blister heads and mid-bosses should be this tension-building threat, but because the game is so thin on enemy interaction, you actually walk around the halls just praying for combat encounters. You got this Requiem, and you want to use it on something, so you're like, come on, blister heads. Now contrast this with Classic Resi, which is supposed to be represented, right? One of the best aspects of Classic Resi's design is that the enemies do not give resources. The enemies are resource drains, or at the very best, resource neutral if you're killing everything with a knife. And why that's really good, and it has nothing to do with homaging the past or anything, is because in terms of balance and progression, if you make the enemy's resources, you are playing a very dangerous game balance-wise. I talked all about this in my Ninja Gaiden 2 review, where what happens is that as the campaign goes on, the resource curve gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and even a well-intentioned developer like Itagaki decides, no, we need to stop this, so I'm going to throw enemies and throw tons of resource draining type of stuff at you to try to break this resource curve. But since the enemies themselves feed into the resource system, it's like trying to put out a fire with wood. It's not impossible, but it's truly an uphill battle. And there comes a point in every game with resource progression that I call the RPG breakaway, or resource overflow, because it's not necessarily just an RPG thing, where the growth of your resources just outpaces the game's natural combat system. Which is why by giving Grace this blood crafting ability and then giving Leon his credit system, it doesn't take long for both of the characters to outpace the changes to Insanity mode. And then once they do that, the game's difficulty can't or doesn't scale to keep up with them, like I talked about earlier. And so why resource overflow is particularly a problem for Resident Evil 9 is that unlike Ninja Gaiden 2, which heavily utilizes natural escalation of introducing not only more enemies in encounters, but also more elite enemy types that fundamentally shift how the game is played, and in a clearly meaningful way, not a little sprinkle here and there, so that the counterforce against
constantly increasing resources
isn't just a stat-based slider, which is what Insanity mode basically offers. And I would say the mark of a good difficulty mode is that the fundamentals are the same, it's just the leniency is stricter. So you're going to play how the game fundamentally plays, but there's less wiggle room for error. That is a properly scaled difficulty, which is why even though Resident Evil 4 Professional isn't a perfectly scaled difficulty mode, it does still maintain this relationship, especially with hit stun. Whereas if you look at the difficulty scaling between Insanity and Standard in Resident Evil 9, in Standard, on the street for example, you can still use headshots into executions in that janky Resident Evil remake type of way. Whereas in Insanity, because your guns are initially so you've got to rely a lot more on perfect parries and using the axe. But then ironically, as your guns power up and you get further into the run, Insanity plays much more like the standard difficulty, and that's not even including metaprogression, which is the next issue. So let's discuss the difference between New Game Plus and metaprogression. And even though I'm not a big fan of either, I do think New Game Plus is vastly better in terms of gameplay structure. And so let's look at Resident Evil 4 for an example. So you buy Resident Evil 4, you put it in your GameCube, and your first playthrough is going to have to be on normal mode because they lock professional, which is lame. So you're going to go through, you're going to beat normal mode, and that will unlock professional, and that will unlock New Game Plus. And so if you want to play New Game Plus, you will be on that save file for your first playthrough. So you'll be playing normal mode again, but now with all of the post-game bonus weapons and stuff like that. Whereas if you want to play professional, that is considered a separate save file. So you've got 3 save files already involved here. You've got your initial playthrough save, you've got your professional playthrough save, and then you've got the system save that allows professional to be unlocked. So this means, by this structure, there is the concept of a clean professional run. Meaning, it's the first run you do in professional mode before you unlock the new Game Plus of professional mode. Now, we all just have to sit and agree that this is how you're supposed to play the game. And the basis for that rests entirely on this structure of separating the runs into different save files. That way you can't get the new Game Plus weapons into that professional mode without having beaten professional in the first place. Let's be real. I think it would be a much cleaner structure if you wanted to have all of these bonus weapons and infinite ammo and stuff if they were placed into their own distinctive campaign called Weapon Master or something like that. Something that cleanly distinguishes the intended difficulty from the bonus difficulty. So if we look at Resident Evil 9, it does not actually have New Game Plus. What it has is metaprogression. And the distinction, and it's a subtle one, is that it never enforces a clean save playthrough. Because once you beat the game, you unlock meta points, and you can spend these meta points on unlocking weapons that you can use in subsequent runs. But the runs are not isolated into individual save files. They all pool together in one metaprogression structure. Which means that when you play Insanity for the first time, you can carry over weapons that you've already unlocked via metaprogression. And because Insanity is locked behind completing a standard run, that means there is no enforced clean run. What you'd have to do is just refuse to spend your metaprogression money. So rather than enforcing the difficulty of Insanity mode on the first playthrough, like professional mode, instead you have to already opt into the difficulty. But why would you do that? The game has no formal incentive to tell you not to. I checked the requirements for the Insanity challenge. It does not make any restriction against using meta-progression weapons. In fact, I am quite sure that Capcom intend for you to use them in Insanity mode, because then they're giving you a solution for that stat disjoint that I was talking about earlier, where if you can't get past the initial difficulty of Insanity, the solution is, well, you just grind out standard difficulty runs for the challenges and get the meta progression power-ups so that when you come into Insanity, you already have that progression boost. I think this is further supported by the fact that even after you unlock these weapons with meta progression, some of them you still need to buy with the in-game economy, which implies some sort of intended balance. But obviously, power level wise, they are OP as especially when you combine them together with certain charms. Like that single shot pistol, if you put the Wesker charm on it, you are one-shotting most of the stuff in Insanity, and the bullet is piercing, so you can do group kills with this mother. So obviously looking at this weapon, that's kind of ridiculous, right? But if you keep looking at some of the other meta progression upgrades, one of them is infinite ammo. And by my calculations, it is possible to grind out enough meta progression points by replaying the standard campaign challenges to be able to unlock infinite ammo.
However, if you got the 10,000 from beating the game, the 5,000 or the 3,000 from Case Closed, the 2,000 from Your Little Rascal, that takes you to 15,000, and combined with the 35,000 that you get from one of these, you only have to do one of them. And the easier of the two, oddly enough, is the never touch the stuff, which means you don't use any heals at all, which is okay because on the easier difficulty, it makes it a little bit better as you heal yourself naturally.
And then the first time that you play Insanity mode, you use infinite ammo. Now, I didn't do this because I don't have the patience to grind out the infinite ammo unlock, but that can't be playing the game properly, right?
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious.
Let me turn you to a little Steam thread. Now, I didn't make this post just to make this clear. I just noticed it and thought this is the perfect example of the problem, where the poster here is voicing his displeasure with this choice. And look at the reaction he gets. It is instantly dismissed as him telling other people how to play their game. And I agree, this random guy on Steam should not be telling you how to play your game. But you know who should be telling you how to play your game? Capcom should. If the developers abandon this responsibility, it becomes immediate chaos. Because who's to say? maybe I'm particularly attached to playing with infinite ammo Requiem throughout the game, and that's how I want to play. And the fact that Capcom are now acknowledging this as valid is just a dream come true. And for that guy, congratulations.
Congratulations!
But I have to point out, if we're going to have discussions about the depth of the game's combat or strategies for how to play the game, honestly, because of this oversight, the correct answer is grind standard mode until you unlock infinite ammo, and then blow the shit out of everything, because the actual skill of this game has nothing to do with combat, has nothing to do with survival horror. The actual skill is grinding. And that is actually what unrestrained metaprogression systems test. Now compare this to another thread on Steam of the original Resident Evil 4, where someone is asking if there is metaprogression with the New Game Plus, and look at the attitude of the commenters. Complete 180 polar opposite, where they're all saying that would be lame, this is about skill, that would undermine the balance of the game. And the reason is because the developer leads the attitude with their structure, with what they allow and what they don't allow. And even though I think the New Game Plus structure is far from perfect, it still enforces the idea of the game having an intended balance. Whereas with metaprogression, the players define their own balance, and from what we're seeing, that seems to heavily favor the path of least resistance. So I have intentionally saved the combat analysis for the end of the video because I think it's really important to point out all of these structural issues first, because if you have a combat system and none of the surrounding game enforces it or makes it meaningful, what's the point? Does having wall contextual executions actually mean anything if you never have to use them? I would argue to some degree, no. But even in isolation, I'm not a huge fan of this combat system. So let's begin with a question. Why does Leon have a crouch walk? Why can Leon do stealth kills for free, whereas with Grace, she needs to use a limited resource? How does this make sense? If you have a game where you're supposed to have two different character archetypes playing two different playstyles, why can Leon not only play Grace's playstyle, but arguably do it better than her? This isn't a question of distinct playstyles, like Leon from Resident Evil 4 and Solid Snake from Metal Gear Solid 2, where if you put them in each other's levels, it would be incoherent. Instead, it's just a question of power scaling. Leon is Mewtwo, Grace is Caterpie. That's why it's funny that people talk about how perfectly integrated the two styles of play are, because Grace is not classic Resi, she's just nerfed action Resi. And the irony is that as an action Resi guy, you'd probably assume that I think the Leon style is like the real game and superior, and the Grace style is garbage. But I think it's actually reversed. The Grace style, because there is some sense of limitation, because there are at least minor stakes to the way she plays, is far more interesting than the Leon style. Like, for example, the melee combat, where Leon not only has one giant ass window of a parry that puts the enemies in a very convenient frame disadvantage. If that's not good enough, he also has the perfect parry that gives him a finisher. And what I find funny about perfect parry is that parry windows are getting so wide and lenient now that they need to essentially make another layer of parry to somewhat replicate what parries used to be. So it's like, okay, parry is now just this insanely OP block with meter, and then perfect parry is more of a traditional parry. But just nullifying attacks and giving a bunch of frame advantage isn't enough of a reward anymore, even though it's insanely OP just on that basis alone, like I talked about earlier. Now you gotta set up for the instant kill. And if your pesky meter runs out, even on Insanity, don't you worry, because they give the stun enough time for you to resharpen your axe and complete the finisher. Because, of course they do. But getting back to Grace, why her style is more interesting is because since she's supposed to be weak and helpless, by modern balance standards, that means she's just slightly OP in this janky way. For example, if you're coming up against a zombie with your knife, if they are a grabbing type of zombie, especially on Insanity, getting around their tracking is very unreliable. Now with Leon, you don't need to worry about this, you just parry. But with Grace, this is legitimately a tricky situation. And so what I ended up discovering for myself, I'm sure other players are aware of this, is that when you do the initial slash with Grace, or that lunging attack, there is a window there where you avoid the grab somehow. I don't know technically what's happening, but it does work. And so if you carefully time the slash or the lunge, you'll be able to prevent the grab. And this setup and window is way more funky than Leon's parry. And if you miss it, and, at least early on, before crafting breaks the save ribbon system, death has some consequences because you have to run it back. You actually have to start routing out Grace's encounters, at least initially, before the resource overflow. And because her movement system is so funky, and we'll get to that next, it ends up being weirdly technical. Like I was mentioning earlier, one strategy is to keep jumping in and out of windows. But in order to prevent yourself from not accidentally jumping in or out of the window when you don't want to, you have to go into knife stance to prevent the context-sensitive jump. Or, if you're fighting against enemies that are armed with weapons, I can't confirm this because I don't actually know what's going on with the frame data, but it seems that the lunging strat is a lot less reliable against them, but the tracking on the physical weapons is than the grabs. So you end up doing this really janky Souls-style combat where you're trying to walk on their side with the weakest tracking so that after they attack, you end up behind them and you can get the knife string. Is any of this well designed?
No.
But it is a dynamic that if the developer realized was interesting, they could build upon and actually create a cool combat system where it's like Souls, but with no dodge roll, and the enemies have grabs that they can mix in with physical melee strikes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's Grace. Because of her built-in limitations, there is some interesting dynamics happening, but they never get a chance to develop. But before we move on to Leon, we have to stop and talk a moment about this game's movement inertia, because this is getting out of hand. AAA games are all about the movement inertia, and they've been in them for quite a while, but it seems like it just keeps escalating more and more. And by the time we hit Resident Evil 9, we have gone full Euro inertia. And when I say full Euro, I'm not referring to Euro shmups, who are infamous for their inertia. Oh no, we're beyond that now. I'm referring to Euro Truck Simulator. We've gone car game territory. The character's movement in this game is so sluggish to start up or change direction, it feels like you're driving a semi-truck. And you can definitely see its effects not only in the enemy interaction, but also in the boss fights. Because your movement is so slow, look how sluggish and basic the boss attacks are. The final boss is the perfect example of this, because the complexity of the limb attacks themselves could not be more basic, but because the inertia is so high, you still have to turn long before the hitbox is near you. And the difference between movement inertia and something like tank controls is that tank controls are a clean state-based limitation. You can't turn and move at the same time. You must choose one or the other, which I do think is particularly fitting to Resident Evil's style because of that disconnection between the enemies being melee-based and the player having a ranged weapon, where you'll notice in a lot of games when you have melee-based enemies and then the player has ranged weapons, one of the most persistent issues, and it's definitely in Resident Evil 9, is circle strafing, because that allows the player to constantly move at an evasive angle that subverts the enemy tracking. But by putting in that disjoint between turning and moving, that creates weak points in the player's movement that enemies can capitalize on. Like if you're cornered, you have to decide preemptively what is probably the safest direction to move in, and then commit to moving in that direction. But if it turns out you need to adjust the angle of your movement, that's going to cost you some time. And during those adjustments in angles, that's where the enemies have their opportunities. That's where they can pin you and strike. That movement limitation is what gives the enemies a game plan. But it's clear, it's accurate, it's precise. Both you and the enemies know what your movement can do and what it cannot do. And so mitigating this limitation is what creates skill distinction between players. Contrast this with movement inertia. Movement inertia is not a clear limitation. It doesn't actually prevent you from doing any specific strategy. In fact, you still can do all of the OP stuff. You can circle strafe, you can change angles, you can move while firing, you can move while reloading, you can move while sharpening your axe, you can parry while moving. There isn't any defined limitation happening. Instead, inertia just tries to evoke the feeling of limitation by making your movement imprecise and unreliable. In other words, it's an artificial filter you place over basic gameplay to make it seem more complicated than it actually is. You could do this with any game, like Pac-Man or Mega Man or Minecraft. It's just an obnoxious surface modifier. It's the mechanical equivalent to yellow paint.
Oh, no.
For example, if you take away the tank controls from Resident Evil 4, it is not Resident Evil 4. If you take away the inertia from Resident Evil 9, it's the same game, just more tolerable to play. So with the inclusion of the axe and its rechargeable parry, its manually striking attacks, and its execution finishes, the days of Resident Evil 4 are long behind us. And that's not very surprising given how mechanically incompatible this third-person shooter style of the new Resident Evil games are with action-oriented Resi, like 4, or even like 5, honestly. So 6 being an inspiration, I'm assuming it must be, makes some sense. But what's funny about that is that basically what Resident Evil 9 does is it tamps down on the more technical, crazy aspects of Resident Evil 6 that makes it a favorite of action game players, especially in Mercs mode, but manages to maintain all of its balance problems. So basically you inherit the worst of Resident Evil 6, but without all the fun, crazy. And the worst aspects of Resident Evil 6 are going to sound familiar because they are 1, overpowered movement, which we just talked about, though at least Resi 6 feels good as you're abusing the movement. 2, overpowered guns, which thanks to metaprogression is an issue that Resi 9 shares. And then 3, the almighty parry overwhelming the natural combat mechanics. The only news here is maybe some people don't know that Resi 6 has an overpowered parry, truly ahead of its time in the modern game design world. And I mean that half ironically, but also half seriously as well. So since we've talked about the other two, let's talk about one remaining aspect of the parry that I want to highlight. So I've already talked about the parry and perfect parry and the way they override the game's natural combat dynamics throughout the video, so we won't need to revisit that. But let's talk about the sharpening, because I guess the idea would be, well, there is one form of limitation, which is having to take the time to charge your meter, so that if you're in a combat scenario, you're going to have to tactically decide when you recharge the meter. Except that's not much of a limitation because the enemy design is not programmed to exploit this weakness. If the game had a dynamic that when your axe meter was low, enemies would aggressively charge your ass to try to attack you before you could recharge your parry, that would be interesting at the very least. But they don't. They don't really react to what's going on with your meter. And so what that means is that when your meter is getting low, what do? You just run away and recharge. And like I pointed out earlier in the video, the game's combat encounters and level design don't trap you or corner you effectively. So even in that first street fight with the blister heads, where your axe is at its lowest durability and everything, even there, if you want, you can just bait the perfect parry, and then if you miss it, run away, recharge, try again. The blister heads can't outrun Leon. They can't chase you down. If you keep moving evasively, and movement inertia isn't going to stop this, it is simple to recharge that meter. And of course, as durability increases over the course of the run, this becomes less of a dynamic anyway, and then even if you get in a small-ish combat arena, like the final boss fight, then maybe there sharpening could have been a factor, except they allow you to move while you sharpen. So rather than being a limitation to constantly circle strafing and outmaneuvering the enemies, instead it's an extra chore in your flowchart. So rather than being this high pressure situation of, ooh, I've got to get the axe sharpened, oh, they're coming, hurry, hurry, instead it becomes, oh, did you remember to brush your teeth today? Did you remember to sharpen your axe? It seems like in modern combat design, the only punishment they can bring themselves to deliver to the player is just tedium. And this is one of those mechanics where on paper, you could describe its use tactically. You could say, oh, well, you're going to get in situations where you're really going to have to choose between taking the risk of recharging it or using it offensively, even if it breaks. But the way everything is balanced, this is much more of a theory crafting type of situation rather than a consistent gameplay dynamic. Because how often is it a bad idea to run away and charge? Almost never, right? Even the final boss fight on Insanity, if you decide, I'm gonna take my time, I'm just gonna slowly run away and recharge, not only is that a safe strategy, that is an effective strategy. And I really want to point that out because how a mechanic functions on paper doesn't really matter if the surrounding design elements don't capitalize on it, which doesn't happen for the sharpening system, and it doesn't happen for the stun system. Serious question. How does stun in Resident Evil 9 work? If I were to Pepsi challenge 100 players and ask them to explain what is going on with stun, how many would be able to? I know I personally found it vague and confusing, and I had to download a mod for the review to try to get to the bottom of what its behavior is doing, or at least the best that I can. And I'm not going to get into the minutia of it all, but the bottom line is that the stun system uses stats. You can see this in the overlay mod. It's referred to as wins. And you can see the numbers drastically change from standard to insanity. That's why the enemies are so tanky. And also there's built-in variation of the stun's behavior. So sometimes it will take different numbers of attacks to get the stun state. The variance isn't massive usually, but it's just enough to be unreliable. So that's already an issue with stun. Core mechanics should be intuitive and self-revealing to the player. That way the player can use them proactively. In Resident Evil 4, that is how stun worked. You understood that if you hit the enemy where you need to hit them, you're gonna get the result, and if you don't, that's down to your own error of execution. Whereas in Resident Evil 9, because of the way the stun system works, it's a mistake to play too proactively because even if you do everything right, the RNG may not be in your favor. And so instead what you do is you play reactively. And there is a really easy way to tell the difference. In reactive play, you are hanging back and waiting for an opportunity to come in safely. In proactive play, you are holding forward. You are moving towards the enemy before they attack. You are overcommitting with confidence. And if you make a mistake, you will pay for it.
I got numbers on the...
Oh! Yo, did he just walk up slowly and down smash?
He did.
So in Resident Evil 4, you will find yourself running towards enemies without your gun drawn so that you are in a more advantageous position after you get the shot into stun. And the better the player you are, the more consistent proactive play becomes. But if you introduce variation into a mechanic, that diminishes its proactive value. Now, the tricky part about this with Resident Evil 9, and why I led with all of the analysis earlier, is that risk detachment makes this kind of meaningless, right? Because in practice, none of this matters, because if you run up and try to do a headshot into stun and it doesn't work, you literally can just reset and it doesn't really matter. So I'm speaking more hypothetically, like if they made a mercenaries mode with much more intense high-stakes combat, and funnily enough, when Resident Evil 4 Remake introduced its mercenaries mode, which isn't necessarily that intense, they did actually adjust to have the headshots and stun be reliable, probably because of this problem. And that is a shorthand for how you can identify what mechanics in modern games are the primary mechanics. What are the mechanics that are reliable? So if you think about Souls, what was the controversial mechanic nobody wanted touched or messed with?
The dodge roll.
People are precious about dodge roll because they rely on it. Now compare the reliability of stun with the reliability of parry in Resident Evil 9. If you are a high skill player in this game, you'd be able to set yourself apart by getting perfect parry every single time. Perfect execution equals perfect consistency. But since stun has built-in variation, this just is not possible. And so what you naturally begin to do is you start to deprioritize it as a primary focus of your combat and instead treat it as a secondary reactive element. And you can see this shift in mentality reflected in player behavior, where you'll notice a lot of times when players are going for stun headshots, they're not moving towards the zombie, they're backing away from it. Just in case the shots don't get the stun, they keep out of counterattack range.
Sue, can you find anything on it?
And so it's the low commitment of the game's moveset that masks how janky the unreliable stun is. Because imagine the stun mechanic, but you can't move while shooting, and the stun window is really short. It's not a coincidence that the stun window in Resident Evil 9 is enormous. It's that long to cover over the fact that the stun is unreliable. Because if the stun window was really short, that would make hit confirming at a long range unviable. So then you'd have to move closer. But then the closer you move, the more reliable you're going to expect the stun to be, because now you're opening yourself up to counterattack. And so you can see how all of these elements impact the game's feel, where the stun is unreliable, so then you need to play reactively to confirm the stun. But if you're confirming the stun, then the stun window needs to be long. And also, since your movement is so slow in Euro, they have to make it even longer to account for that. And then it gets to the point where is even approaching stunned enemies really that worth it? Because you're getting a lot of mileage just leaving them stunned. That's why, for example, the basement meat grinder encounter for Grace is so easily exploited. It's because after you put the zombies in stun, they want you to run over and take the risk of pushing them, but you can just leave them in stun state and safely keep your distance. And so even though the stun system has similar mechanics as Resident Evil 6, with the wall executions and everything, it doesn't have nearly the same dynamics. And the difference, put simply, is in Resident Evil 9, you hold back. In Resident Evil 6, you hold forward. So that's my problem with the stun system in terms of feel. Now let's talk about its issues in terms of balance. So I hinted about this before when I talked about the professional mode of Resident Evil 4 and how it scales very nicely, because the same strategies that you use in normal difficulty translate over to professional. It's just that you need to play more consistently, essentially. One big reason for that is because it uses this clean state-based stun, where if you do a headshot in normal, you do a headshot in professional, you're going to get the same result. Now contrast this with the behavior of stun in standard versus insanity, especially at the beginning of the run, which I mentioned in the resource overflow section. What's a big problem with using stat-based stun, especially in a game with progression leveling up mechanics, as well as dynamic difficulty, is that the balance of the stun becomes this constant moving target that, at best, adjusts itself to be somewhat reliable, similar to state-based stun, but at worst, becomes complete garbage where the enemies are not reacting to stun. Meanwhile, one perfect parry solved. And this doesn't just affect the handguns, it also affects your manual axe swings, which feel like in Insanity because the enemies aren't responding to the attack. And you don't know when they will because stun is this mysterious variable that you need to get a PhD in to understand how to even utilize. There's this great term in pinball called chopping wood. That is the manual melee attacks of Resident Evil 9.
Chopping wood.
This is why Sekiro added the posture meter, because if you're going to use this stat-based flinch stagger thing, at least communicate what effect you're having underneath the hood back to the player, because otherwise the melee attacks often
feel like a frame trap
more so than a combat tool. And here's a question. What is the best difficulty of Resident Evil 9 gameplay-wise? The answer should be Insanity, because Standard is baby mode easy, but because of this scaling issue with the stun, Insanity feels like garbage to play until you get your weapons more powered up, either through metaprogression or through just the in-game progression system later in the campaign. But then once you get your weapons powered up, because Insanity mode is relying mostly on stats to create its sense of difficulty, it just goes back down to being similar to Standard mode. How could you make this game harder in this paradigm? What if you did a double Insanity? So you took the slider values of Insanity and then doubled them. What about tripled them? Notice in this style of enemy scaling, as you increase the stats, their behavior becomes more static rather than more dynamic. That is why placing so much of your core balance on statistical values like this is not a good idea. Instead, what the developer should do if they want to scale up the difficulty is introduce natural counters to stun, like having the enemies wear helmets that have only a small hittable area, or giving them physical shields that block small arms fire, or having certain enemy types that are only vulnerable from their back. Wait, that's what Resident Evil 4 does, and it works so much better because let's say you wanted to make an ultra difficulty for Resident Evil 4, what you could do is not only make the changes that professional mode does, you could add in these enemy types in dangerous combinations earlier into the game. You could redesign the campaign to be more dense and aggressive, like Master Ninja. That is proper difficulty scaling. And it's going to be a mess to do if you tie a core fundamental aspect of enemy design, like stun, to a stat system.
It needs to be reliable.
It needs to naturally connect together to the rest of the combat system. Otherwise, you're constantly chasing this balance curve. But I also want to point out where Resident Evil 9's mechanics feel weirdly natural, in a way that, if you think about it, they shouldn't, which is in the lab section when they bring in all the gun-wielding SWAT enemies. That should be awkward and unnatural because of all the mechanical limitation, like Resident Evil 4, but it doesn't. It feels right. It's like the mechanics found their home. They're like, I'm in the correct game. Wait a second here. My crouch walk makes sense. My ability to move and aim makes sense. The emphasis on shooting makes sense. Even the parry makes some sense because with the standard enemies throwing projectiles, like I talked about in Resident Evil 4 Remake, that's completely pointless because you can just parry them and it's like a very easy parry challenge. But you know what you can't parry? Bullets, motherfucker. And so when you're fighting the gun enemies and they're shooting you, you have to start to take the space more seriously, and you have to play somewhat proactively, right? Because you have to commit to running for cover. Now this dynamic barely lasts because Resi 9 is so underdeveloped, but it's enough of a preview to see this is what the game wants to be. Even if Capcom might not want that, because of the mechanical influences they're pulling from, which are tactical stealth cover shooters, it makes sense that the enemies are playing the game too. You can't circle strafe high-speed bullets. And speaking of the scalability issue that I was just talking about, there was one moment of hope in Insanity where in that first warehouse encounter where they bring in the extra gun enemy spawns. That was a moment where I was like, okay, Capcom, I see what you're gonna do. you get it, you understand that real enemies in this game are gun-wielding enemies. And so what you're going to do, and it makes complete sense, is you're going to have them be a constant presence in Insanity mode. So as you go through all the encounters, there's going to be these backup gun enemies enforcing the level design a little bit. Nope, that was just a coincidence, because in the very next section,
Blisterheads.
So where Leon finds himself, combat design-wise, in Resident Evil 9, is at this weird crossroads where he's way too overpowered for the standard melee-based zombie enemies at this point. Clearly, there just are not enough limitations to make that style of gameplay interesting. So in a more hopeful AAA landscape, I could charitably conclude that Resident Evil 9, as underdeveloped as it is just the story of a team finding their footing, and in the follow-up games, they're going to try to build and develop these elements more. But this team has been around for quite a while now. They done found their footing. And I get the sense that the fact that Leon is so clearly overpowered is kind of the point, and that the encounters are static and easily solvable is the point, and that this is not considered underdeveloped, but rather properly developed by current AAA standards. And so when I think about Resident Evil 9's design philosophy overall, the term that comes to mind is risk aversion, both in a macro sense and in a micro sense. In the macro sense, that they wanted to include as much variety as possible to try to appeal to the widest audience as possible, even if that means sacrificing focus and development on the most interesting elements of this game's structure, which I would argue is the Grace campaign. And like I said earlier, it feels like they just dropped her off the edge of a cliff, and then focused much more time and attention on Leon, because it is a glaring omission that Leon intercuts with Grace's care center, but Grace does not intercut with Leon's Raccoon City. There's no reason why they couldn't have made really interesting encounters for her in that area as well, but it comes across, and I can't prove this or anything, just how it comes across is that basically they started with the Grace campaign and they felt, we don't know how this is going to do, this may not perform super well, or we're not sure where to go with this, so call in the assist, here comes Leon. The remakes sell like hotcakes, and while we're at it, give him a God of War axe, and we're going to get those action game bros as well. Now, I'm not saying that it necessarily happened like this or anything, but that is how it comes across structurally, with how lopsided and weird it is. Because if, let's say, there were two halves of the game's design, and they were sort of both trying to equally represent inclusion in the game, wouldn't someone point out how insane it is that Grace doesn't have proper boss fights, really? And the save ribbon system just stops mattering? All of these clear design overlap opportunities are just tossed away.
Why isn't it possible? It's just not. Why not, you stupid?
And the lab seems thrown together in a hurry. Same thing with Leon's bosses. I actually was shocked when I beat the final boss, and then that was it. It didn't feel like the game came to a climax. It feels like it just sort of trails off by the end. And it's not about runtime. I want to make that clear. It's about development. It's the difference between watching a limited series like Succession with a fully developed arc and structure, and then watching two canceled TV shows back to back. The length is there, but it's not a holistic experience. So that's the macro side. And then on the micro side, in terms of the enemy design, the level design, the encounters, the boss fights, the resource management, the difficulty, the meta progression, basically all of the in-game moment-to-moment elements, everything is so mild and subdued. And if any gameplay element threatens to get interesting, like Grace's combat, that gets hammered down before it's too late.
Yes, I want to report a murder. No murders.
What I think the game really leans on is its production value, because I will say that the strongest element of Requiem, obviously, is its production values. And I do think deep down that is one reason why Capcom get away with as much as they do. Like Grace, for example. They did a great job on Grace as a character. She's really cool and pretty distinctive. And so when they have level design that equals run down hall, run up staircase, cross flat surface, The model, the animations, the voice acting are all hard carrying what is nothing gameplay-wise. And that I find even more frustrating, because if I start to end up liking Grace as a character, you kind of want her to be in a real game at some point, rather than just
a glorified demo.
And you get this with Leon as well, like the bike chase section. I feel bad for the artists that put all of that effort and work into the bike chase section, and the gameplay is borderline a QTE. It's not impossible that Capcom could have used this opportunity to make a cool little rail shooter section or something, but the irony of games like Resident Evil 9 that have really nice production is that AAA developers seem to feel now that quality gameplay is like a nuisance to their production values, like it gets in the way of them, whereas I feel the opposite, where great production values should be honored with great gameplay. It's kind of a funny paradox if you think about it. And overall, I think that is a fitting assessment of Resident Evil 9, where Capcom wants to deliver this giant, epic experience, but gameplay, difficulty, long-term consequences, those are a barrier that needs to be bypassed, rather than a pillar of what the game is trying to achieve.
Fulfill your destiny, and all will be forgiven.
And so, if you enjoyed this review, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and support me on Patreon, because giant reviews like this just could not be financially viable without the support of the patrons, so thank you. And also check out my Mercenaries tier list video, because Mercenaries is awesome and I think it perfectly complements this review. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 10, 11, 100, 100, Absconditis, Adam Kesey, Eternal Solitude, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, Allison, AMH, Andres, Anthony A, Pick Patrick, Arcade Hell, A Royal Guard, Arg, Arrow Viper, Au Ally, Autonamed, Axel Rate, Bandover Tui, Baron Metzgerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Dazzle, Bo, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Chabalski, Vito Dames, BK, Blader, Bobo Jr., Boghog, Borky22, Boston Crab, Brodequin, The Lonely Poet, Bruh, Bruno De Manos, Bunny Clyde, Bohem, Cadno, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Carmel Tortoise, Catrite Studio, CC, Cha, Chad Goulding, Shimor De Kulere, Chaflip, Chowdahound, Kristen Socal, Krista Lee, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino, Clairvoyant Longwater, Claircliff, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Koifish, Crew Expendable, Judo, Cyborg Number Blue, CCR, Des Audio, Damien Thorne, Dan Matei, Danchi, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dederator, Demian Smirnoff, DRAM, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dingus, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Dr. B, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton, Breton, Dropout, Duality, Duckies, Earth, Easter Egg, Echo Rose, Echo SSS, Edvard, Eggy, Elvin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Ellis Defeche, Empty Disco, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Uwil, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Factory 117, Falcus, Finish Mathai, Final Masonry, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, FNM Roldy, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francis York Morgan, Freckle Lord, Fry Guy Official, Gabriel Forner, Gabby Plaget, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gary Kelly, Gate Chase, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Ghost Boy, Good But Overly Long Neo Soul Songs, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, HDZ274, Hero Death, Thomas Hardhat, Unhearthy, HUD, Hugh Mungus, Infinite Forest, Ink Goblin, Irandoms, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James M, Jaron, Jason, J McCarthy, JC Denton, J67, JLab, JCC, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, Jin, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Smith, John Walker, Johnio, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Joshua Patton, Josie, JT, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, K-Cub, Ken 10082, Kevin Den, King Joker, Cowken, Praise the Boys, Kuma Wamu, Kurisho, Kurt Van Ristel, Kurt Varco, Kai Arts, Kyrol, Liam Huber, Leon 616, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lilich, Macabre Monster, Matt Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Marco, Mario, Mario Simic, Marshmallow, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Patau, Maz, Mecca Roca, Minong, Meister, Men's Raya 96, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Michael Smith, Mig ZVM, Mike Mel, Milk Lipton, Milo Shamel, Mimi 573, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Morpai, Monroe, Monsta Zero, Musashi, Michigan, Naps 91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Perro, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nice Marmot, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nicole, Niflheim, Ninth Circle Skit, Not Telnu, Not Your Beagle League, Oatware, Oklakugels, Oleg Palmasev, Oliver Gavaro, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Flop, PLP, Pocho, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Scheme, Renholtz Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Victor, Ricky Fang, Robert Chang, Robert Jeffrey, Rockin' Sockin, Roop Allender, Rory Starks, Rolf 015, Rulo, Running a Coup, Salmon Connections, Samuel Ward, Sebastian Bobola, Seymour, Senpai Please, Cyril XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Jitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, True, Silicoid, Simon Poland, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Sleeper, Sneed, Social Kid, Spagward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Spooky Tanuki, Steady AI, Stepable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tanzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, Dana Oat, The Dirty Screech, The Hidden Fortress, The Kachow, Bien 1, Yo Bensta, The Smartest Billy, Tom McCarthy, 3-Wave, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tricky P, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, Tushar Thacker, 2YU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typo Error, Unchristian, Umtal Deda, Uro Keeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Val, Vandal, Melanex, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Briste, Wizard 16, Vlad SDG, Rabby Legs, What Is This, Willa Ross, William Miller, William Wallace, Yaki Back, Yaz, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yeastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach Attack, Zach Zachabaj, Zenryoku, Zerolux, Andre Lykov.